I'd like to share with you the Dvar Torah I gave at my synagogue this past Shabbat, Parshat Lecha, and share with you some of my thoughts on the current situation. Before I do so, I do want to thank Rabbi Dr. Mordechai Schiffman, who provided a number of the sources from which I will quote today. And the place I'd like to begin is with the story of Shlomo Ran, who was a 85-year-old grandfather living in one of the kibbutzim near Gaza. He was living in one of the kibbutzim in a house with his wife and daughters, and his grandson was with him. And they, of course, heard what was going on outside, the Hamas terrorists going from house to house, just murdering everyone inside. And he hatched a plan to save his family, and it included that he hid them in their safe room, his wife and daughters and grandson, shut the door, of course, and then he casually sat outside and in the living room and sat on the sofa. And the plan was that these murderous terrorists would come in, they would see him, maybe be surprised that he didn't try to hide. Perhaps this old man didn't even know what was going on. Perhaps he didn't even hear the slaughter that was taking place outside. They would kill him, assume that he lived there alone, and then just go on to the next house. And indeed, that is exactly what happened. They burst into the house. They saw an old man sitting at the couch. He was simply waiting there to die. They killed him, and then they left. And his wife and grandson and daughters were able to survive. And when I read this story, I thought to myself, where does this moral courage, this moral creativity, ingenuity come from? What was he thinking? What inspired him to behave in such a morally incredibly sensitive and courageous, heroic fashion? And I'd like to suggest not so much an answer, because I think each person, there's so many of these stories of people who've done tremendous superhuman things during this time period. And each story has its own reasons and own motivations, but perhaps to provide some framework and to learn from one of his ancestors, one of all of our ancestors, Avraham, Abraham, the first Jew. Because this is the Parsha, of course, where Avraham is also confronted with a moral dilemma, and he too seems to rise to the occasion, and it's one that's confronting Israel at this very moment. His nephew Lot is kidnapped. There was a war between the 5 kings and the 4 kings, and Stone, they take him away, they kidnap Lot, and Lot now is a captive, and Avram hears about this and is confronted with the question of whether or not he's going to risk his life, his promise that God gave him, that he will inherit this land and create a whole nation. Should he risk it all to save his nephew Lot, with whom he just recently had a disagreement with? They split. They split their ways. They went in different directions. Had difference of opinions of how to create the ideal society. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky asks this question, and he sort of projects on Avraham a halachic discussion. What does the halacha say? What does the Jewish law say? Does he have to risk his life in this instance to save his kidnapped nephew Lot? And when reviewing all of the halachic sources, he comes to the conclusion, and he assumes Avraham would know this as well, he is not legally obligated to risk his life to save his nephew Lot. Just not. He doesn't have to risk his life and possibly give up his life to save someone else's life. It's just not how the halacha works. And yet he does it anyway. And so the question is why? Why does Avraham risk his life in this instance? Where does that courage come from? Where does that wisdom come from if it's not enshrined in Jewish law and the halacha? So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky offers 2 possible explanations. His first is based upon a midrash. His first is sort of a unique, I would say, parochial argument. And the second, we will look in just a moment, is more of a universalist argument. So this first argument is based upon the midrash, and it tells the story of Avraham's brother, Haran, who is also Lot's father. And the midrash tells us how Avraham was thrown into fire, he miraculously comes out, and Nimrod throws Haran into the fire as well. And the midrash suggests the reason why Nimrod threw Haran into the fire is because Haran was standing by Avraham's side. We don't know if Haran agreed with everything that Avraham said. We don't know if he agreed with him on the entire concept of monotheism that so irritated people that Avraham was championing. We don't know if Haran also championed this idea. Maybe he just was supporting his brother, right or wrong. He was there, standing by his side. Whatever the reason be, he sacrifices his life to be with in support of his brother. So the Midrash intimates, and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests, that perhaps what inspired Avraham to watch over his nephew Lot is a sense of obligation, a sense of familial obligation, of closeness, because of their relationship, because of what have they done together, because he and his father, Lot's father, Haran, went through the fire together, went through struggles together, went through trauma together, they experienced these difficulties together. That inspires an obligation to protect Haran's descendants. This is something I think the Jewish people unfortunately know very, very well. We have been through many fires together. We've been through many tragedies together. And whatever our differences are, the differences that are perhaps maybe even greater between Avraham and Lot, whatever the differences are, because we have that shared experience of going through the fire together, we feel a sense of obligation to one another. And you saw that instantly when this war was thrust upon the Jewish people. People who had been arguing for the previous year threw away their arguments, ran together to fight with one another, and both in the front lines, the physical front lines, as well as in the home front, in tremendously powerful and poignant ways. This concept of feeling obligated to people you're closer to, whether it's your family, your friends, your community, sometimes people are hesitant to embrace this idea. Aren't we all universalists? Shouldn't we care the exact same for every single person? And the answer is yes, we should. But we don't. And there's a moral justification for this sort of emotional, gut instinctual reaction. I remember when I was in college, there was a guest professor, John DeJoya, who was the dean of Georgetown University, where I went at the time, and he subsequently has become the president. And he gave a guest class in our ethics class, and he spoke about communitarianism. And I remember even to this day, 30-something years later, his example that he gave to explain communitarianism. He argued, of course, we should feel obligated to everyone because everyone is a human being and we owe every human the same obligations. But he says, but maybe you owe some people a little bit more. And he told the story, which I think his example he was trying to relate to experienced college students in those days would be familiar with. You're at a bar, and you go with 3 or 4 of your friends. You go with your roommate, perhaps, and your roommate, your friend, becomes drunk, incapacitated, and they're stumbling around, and it's not clear that they're going to be able to make it home on their own, and who knows what might happen if they're left to themselves. Who might take advantage of them? And so he says, or asks, do you have a greater obligation to help your friend, your roommate, your relative get home, more so than a person who's equally incapacitated, equally drunk on the other side of the room? And he says he thinks you do. He thinks you have a greater obligation for the person whom you have a closer relationship with. And I would like to add to his example and point out a few of the reasons why maybe it makes more sense, both on a practical as well as on a theoretical and an ethical point of view. Practical is very simple. First of all, if I go try to help that other person across the room who I have no relationship with whatsoever, people will be suspicious of my motives. They'll wonder, why are you doing this? Also, I may not be able to be so helpful. I don't know where the person lives. I don't know what their specific needs are, but my friend who I've come with, I know where that person lives. I know that, for example, that they would get sick if I took them home in a taxi, but they'd feel much better if I walked home with them instead. And so when you are closer to someone, you know what the person needs more, you can take better care of them as a result. And perhaps you might do damage to a person who you're less close with. But more than that, I think part of the value underlying this concept of communitarianism is the idea that ultimately this is how you actually get to a universalism, right? Because if everyone is taking care of their own and making sure to provide for one another in this meaningful, very positive way, then ultimately everyone is taken care of. One of the terrible things about Hamas is that they don't take care of their own. They don't watch over their own citizenry. And therefore, it sort of breaks up this model. Whereas if I'm making sure that my citizenry is taken care of and safe, and they're taking care of their citizenry, then everyone is ultimately taken care of. But once they abandon that obligation, then we have a bigger problem. The point has often been made that there are not wars between democracies. And the reason why there's not war between democracies is because the democracies understand that going to war is a terrible thing that's not good for their people. And they'll only go to it, as Israel is now doing it, if they have no other choice. But Hamas, who feels no obligation to its people, doesn't mind them being destroyed as a result, will jump to war whenever they may want to. So there's, I think, an argument to be made that one need not be embarrassed or ashamed that they feel a closeness to a particular person, a particular family, a particular community, and that they're willing to go above and beyond for that people. That ultimately is one of the ways that everyone can be helped out as a result. The second answer that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests starts from a more universal perspective, as I mentioned. He says, what gave Avraham the courage to try to save Lot? Not because it was specifically Lot, but he had a moral intuition. The halacha didn't tell him he had to do this, but beyond the halacha, beyond Jewish law, God gave him a conscience. God gave him moral insight. It's part of our creation, part of what it means to be a human being, that God implanted within us this natural instinct, this natural desire to be moral, to give to others, to take care of others. And so Avraham had a natural instinct that he cultivated and developed and answered whenever the call was made. All of us have that moral instinct. We don't always listen to it, perhaps with the same sensitive and inquisitiveness ear that Avraham did, but that's what we should be doing. Dr. Walter Wurzburger, Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, who taught at Yeshiva University, makes a similar point, and he sort of builds on this idea and says that the halacha is the basis, the Jewish law is the basis of our ethical standards, but it's not the ceiling of our ethical standards. It provides the basis from which we operate, but our own moral instincts have to take us to a higher levels, and we have to develop it even more. So that's what Avraham had going for him. The Netziv uses this idea to explain why we even have the entire book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. It's not a book of law. It doesn't help us explain Jewish law that significantly. Why do we need it? The people of the book, the people that's focusing on law, why do we need Bereshit? It's to not just praise the moral exquisiteness of people like Avraham, but to provide us a model, an example of how to cultivate our own moral instincts. And here too I point out that the moral instincts that God gave us is universal. Everyone has it. And you have to be educated against having it to actually lose it. And that's another thing that's so terrible about Hamas, that they consciously, purposely, consistently, and unfortunately effectively educate against, to quiet that moral voice. They have to, in a sense, overcome the natural instinct to want to give, and they have to destroy it in order to demonstrate their evil qualities. Avram gives us an example of that it's there, and we should listen to it, that we shouldn't wait until everything makes sense to jump in to help another person, that until the books, the black and white law says, okay, now you can run forward and help someone who's in need. You should be able to cultivate that voice. You hear it so clearly, instinctively, and jump and take advantage of it whenever you can. This idea of the universal nature of this moral instinct has been, I think, discussed and demonstrated in many different fields of study. The moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt has written about it extensively. He notes that in societies across the world with various different cultures, with various different backgrounds, all people react similarly to certain fundamental moral concepts of justice and fairness. We see this even with young babies, 18 months old. They see someone who's treated unfairly. You can see that it bothers them. They will give up something of theirs to make a person feel more comfortable. They'll give a person who appears cold a blanket so they have they have warmth. It's something that's natural within us. Others have done studies that show the impulse to do good doesn't just benefit our relationship with other people, it's for our own benefit as well. There are studies that show, for example, people are given money, and half the people in the study are told to spend that money on themselves, and the other half are told to spend the money on others. And across the board, those who spend the money on others, based upon some objective standards and surveys, are always happier than those who spend the money on themselves. In another study quoted by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he notes that people who give money are happier than even getting a raise in their own salary, up to the point of having their salary doubled has the same value of giving a portion of their funds to other people. Because the more we give away, the more we actually benefit. And there are many, many other examples that make this same case. And I'd like to just end by sharing two stories, one connected to the current crisis and one from a few decades ago, that I think emphasize this point and highlight this point quite beautifully. So the first story is about the daughter of a rabbi, Rabbi David Froman, tells the story of his daughter who walked in one of the supermarkets here in Israel. For those of you who are in Israel know that these days you go to supermarkets, people are collecting everything. There are teenagers walking the aisles asking you, coming up to the shopper saying if you would be able to buy this or that for a particular cause, for soldiers, for evacuees, for people in need. This daughter, woman, goes to a supermarket. She's outside the supermarket and she comes across a woman who is collecting food outside. And the daughter asks, who are you collecting for? And the woman collecting doesn't really even know. It's not for soldiers, it's not for evacuees per se. She says, I'm collecting, but she doesn't know who even she's specifically collecting for. So the daughter thinks this is somewhat odd, but nevertheless, she listens to that moral voice inside of her. What's the harm to give? And so she goes inside to the supermarket. She buys an extra chicken. On her way out, she gives the chicken to the woman who's collecting. And they start talking and having a conversation a little bit. And the woman who's collecting says, you probably don't even know who I am. And the daughter says, I don't. And she goes on to explain that she is the mother of one of the children who has been kidnapped by Hamas and is being held in the tunnels underneath Gaza City. And she goes on to say that she felt imprisoned at home, imprisoned by grief and imprisoned by anger. And I understand what she might be referring to. I can't understand or imagine the pain and grief that she's going through, but I understand this terrible imprisoning effect that grief and anger have. Both of them are cyclical. When someone gets angry, and especially when it's justified anger, right? They're right to be angry. They're right to be angry at a specific person. The person has wronged them. You don't want to give it up because you're right. And what happens is that anger expands and it deepens, and you can't escape it. And when it expands, not only do you become angry at the person who deserves your wrath and anger, but you begin to get angry with everyone, even with allies, and you begin to blame allies. Maybe they're not doing enough to help you. They're even friends who are trying are just not doing enough. The same thing happens with grief. That when you're grieving over someone, you can't leave it, because if you leave it, you feel like maybe it's somehow an abandonment, a betrayal of the one whom you love, and so therefore you can never let them out of your mind. You can never do anything. You can never be concerned with anyone else except that person for whom you're grieving. And so again, it's a cycle, and it brings you lower and lower and deeper and darker into a prison. And so this woman says, I had to break free from the prison. And the only thing that would allow me to break free is to start thinking, caring about other people. I didn't even know who I had to care about, but I had to collect some food. I had to do something for someone who is in need in order to help me break free. I had to go beyond myself in order to free myself. Of course, she doesn't give up hope for her son, doesn't give up the anger nor the grief she's feeling, but she's able to manage it once she has concern for other people as well. And the final story I want to share also emphasizes this point of going beyond and this idea of love. I was hearing the story, listening to the story of a Yemenite Jew who was the guard for Eichmann. As you will recall, Adolf Eichmann, who masterminded the final solution for Hitler, the Shlomo, is captured by Israel, and there's a trial taking place in Jerusalem where he reveals all the depravity of his terrible plan and the murderous nature of it. And as the trial is going on, there are many people who actually, survivors, Holocaust survivors and others, who want to kill him, want to murder him, don't want to wait for the judicial system to go through its slow, arduous path, and God forbid, maybe would come to a wrong conclusion, whatever the case may be. So there are people out there who are murdering. So this particular Yemenite Jew is selected to guard Eichmann, and there is a German TV station, TV show that wants to interview him. This is decades after Eichmann has already been executed. They want to ask him what it was like to guard Eichmann. And he says, I'll do this only on one condition, that if we have the interview by the Kotel, by the Western Wall, at a certain time, and you'll interview me there. And they say, it can't be done. We need the studio, we can control sound and distractions and everything like that. He says, well, if you want the interview, that's the condition, so they agree to it. And he explains why he wanted to do it at the Kotel, so they should see the liveliness, the vibrancy, the dynamism of the Jewish people at the core, at the center of our Jewish destiny at the Western Wall and near the Temple Mount. And he then tells some of the following anecdotes about his job. What's interesting is he wasn't guarding Eichmann so Eichmann wouldn't escape, but rather he was guarding Eichmann from others who might want to kill him, as I've explained already. And there was actually layer after layer after layer of guards. There were guards who had to guard the guards to make sure that the guards too weren't gotten to, and then would kill Eichmann. So he was the last line of defense. So much so, he explains, that he had to taste the food that was given to Eichmann for his meals. He had to eat from it first to make sure it wasn't poisoned, so that someone wasn't trying to poison, even one of the fellow guards, poison Eichmann to kill him. And at first, when I heard the story, I said, isn't that absolutely terrible that this poor, Jew had to risk his life every single time for Eichmann, of all people. He had to taste his food. And then I realized his life was never really in danger. Because once people understood, and it was told, it was made public, that he would be tasting the food, once everyone knew that there was another Jew who was going to be tasting the food, there was no one who was possibly going to poison the food in order to get at Eichmann. Because as angry and filled with hate and desire for revenge that many people had to get at Eichmann, the love they had for this fellow individual would always trump that hate and that desire for revenge. The desire to give to others, the desire to extend love is much more powerful. And therefore we have to cultivate that desire to love, the desire to love people who are close to us, our family and friends, and eventually have it to expand to others as well, and to destroy those terrible ideologies that try to uproot that sense of love that's natural in the human heart and the connection that we have with other people. And when we extend that love, as you've seen here in Israel over the last few weeks, of what people are willing to do for one another, the soldier who runs into danger, the non-soldier who runs into danger, the entire nation who drops everything to do its best to help others in need as much as they can, we have to cultivate that even more so. And with that, of course, there's no possibility that we won't be victorious.